In this video, we're going to talk about the true story of how a barking dog changed the way Greek grammar was taught for over 80 years. And it was taught wrongly as a result of this barking dog. Stay tuned till the end, I'll talk about how that happened. Well, this is just one of many things that have been taught in Greek grammar in seminaries for a really long time that have been overturned by linguistic research and probably shouldn't be taught anymore. And it's possible that you have been taught some of the things that come out of things like this. Now, of course, I don't need to tell you that if we learn Greek wrong and if we learn these grammar principles wrong, it's going to have massive flow-on effect. It's going to affect the way we look at the language. It then flows into the way we translate the Bible into English. It also flows into our teaching. And many of the things I'm about to talk about come out in teaching, in pulpits, and I hear them, and I'm sure you do too, regularly. So let's get into it so that you don't end up preaching things like durative presence in the Gospel of John to say this is an ongoing thing that always applies, like we hear week in and week out from pulpits all over the place. Perhaps one of the most shocking advances in Greek over the years, and one of the things that I think is the most jarring for me, I think, as I learnt this, and also for many of our students as they learn this and compare it to their knowledge of English, is this assumption that the Greek verb system works very similarly to English, and that is English, like many modern languages, are very time-oriented language, tense-based languages. But Greek, and particularly Kenny Greek, is not time-based at all. It is aspectual in its focus and therefore fundamentally different to how we communicate things in English and in many modern languages. For instance, many Greek grammars will talk about the present tense as indicating an action that is currently in progress, or the Arist Tense as an event that refers to something that took place in the past, or the perfect tense form, which refers to a verb that took place in the past with ongoing results. All of these understandings of the language of these particular verb forms have been overturned, really, with the discussion and advances in linguistics over the last 30, 40 years. Now, there is still debate about how much we should understand time and how time actually does work in Greek verb forms. However, it's universally agreed now that verbs in Kenny Greek are really aspectual, at least primarily, if not entirely. And the idea of time in these verb forms is very much more driven by the context rather than by the verb form itself. And yet, despite this, many Greek teachers continue to teach the language as if time is built into the verb forms themselves and is the very warp and woof of what we teach with regards to the language. But again, ancient Greek and modern English, in terms of the way we view time, are just very, very different. So this approach to verb forms is incorrect, and grammars need to update if they haven't already done so. And to be sure, most have. Most modern grammars argue that verb forms are aspectual first and foremost, and how much time comes into that then depends on kind of a bunch of different factors. But if this is the way you were taught Greek, it may be time to update your Greek. If you're finding this video and this content helpful, then it's possible that we can help you go even deeper, regardless of where you are in your knowledge of Greek and Hebrew. If you go to bma.to/get-started, we have a quiz there which will ask you just a handful of questions, and at the end of those questions, it will give you two options to take your next best step forward to being able to read and study the Bible in the original languages without tools, without having to depend on readers' editions, and so on and so forth. And of course, if you don't want to learn Greek, we've also got recommendations in this for you there as well. So bma.to/get-started, whatever level you're at, this will give you your next best step to get into learning to study and read the New Testament in the original languages. A second misconception is around the Arist Tense, and particularly there was a number of grammars that taught for not a very long time, but for a few decades, that the Arist Tense should be understood as referring to an event that takes place over a very short time, and therefore you see it as a completed short-term event. Well, again, this is another one of those misconceptions and leads to some mischief. And this particular misconception has found its way into many commentaries. And as a result of this, we get theological assumptions and sometimes errors. We get misapplied biblical commands, and we sometimes get preaching that flows out of that as well. So a good example of this could be, for instance, Romans chapter 8, verse 2, "For the law of the Spirit of life has set me free from the law of sin and death." Now, the verb form here, eleutherosen, means to set free, right? And Paul here uses the aorist verb form because he's just making a statement about what's taken place without meaning anything particularly special about it. So there's nothing particularly special about the verb, and there's nothing particularly special about Paul's selection of the aorist verb form to make his point here. However, there are commentaries out there, popular commentaries, that take this and build a theological point on it. Now, the point here is not to argue with the theology. I actually agree with the theology. The point here is to say the theology does not emerge from the verb form. And that is in the Bible Knowledge Commentary, which is a really widely used commentary. The author there says, "This law set me free," and then embraces, in parentheses, he says, "The aorist tense suggests a once-for-all act of freedom at salvation from the law of sin and death." Now, this is just drawing too much out of the aorist verb form. This is almost like he's saying here that because it's in the aorist, it happened once and it can't ever be repeated. But that just doesn't work. For instance, if we go to passages like John chapter 7, verse 10, where it says, "Jesus went up into Jerusalem." It uses the aorist verb form. And if we were to take that same line of reasoning and say, well, Jesus went up into Jerusalem, he did it once and he's never going to do it again. Well, that's, again, not the point that the author's trying to make. He's just trying to make the point it happened, and he's not trying to make any theological arguments about it beyond that. The theology comes out of the context, and so in that sense, I agree with the conclusion of the Bible Knowledge Commentary, but disagree that that comes from the use of the aorist verb form. So watch out for uses of the aorist to say this was a one-time event that never can happen again, or a punctiliar event that takes place over a short period of time. These are poor understandings of the Greek grammar, and if you were taught this in seminary, it may be time to update your Greek. The third one we're going to talk about is the middle voice, and this is perhaps less surprising because I've talked about this on the channel before. But for many years, the middle voice was taught as if it meant the author or the speaker or the subject of the verb was performing the action on themselves. Is almost to say you need to use a reflexive pronoun in the translation. So he washed himself, for instance, which is a really classic use of the middle voice to indicate that the speaker or the subject in this particular case is being acted on as well as doing the acting as well. And so the idea of himself or herself in English does make sense in some of these cases. But to say that this is what it always means is to push the middle voice into a small corner and not understand its dynamic breadth. There's a lot more to it, and it really has the idea of subject affectedness. So in Greek, you don't need a reflexive pronoun, himself, herself, itself, whatever, in order to use the middle voice. The middle voice tells you that the subject is affected by the action of the verb. Now, in English, we might need that, but just because we need it in English doesn't mean that's what the verb in Greek means. Now, this has been misapplied in some cases. For instance, in Philippians chapter 1, verse 27, Paul says, "Conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ." And the verb here, politevester, is a verb that has the idea of living as a citizen. And so this is actually used twice in the book of Philippians, and it's quite significant because Philippi was a place that really prided themselves on being a Roman colony, and so it kind of fits in that sense. So live as a citizen, if you like, but not of this colony, this Roman colony, but as a member of a citizen of the kingdom of heaven, if you like, is a better way of understanding that. And so in this case, some commentators, and there's one particularly, West's word study from the Greek New Testament, he makes the argument in his book saying the man is prodding his own conscience because it's in the middle voice. In other words, because it's in the middle voice, the author needs to, or the subject, the Philippians need to be prodding their own consciences, because that's what the middle voice means, as they do this. And that's that subject, it's more than subject effectiveness. This is that idea where you're doing it to yourself. And again, it's that idea of taking that English idea and bringing it back into Kenny Greek, and it just doesn't work that way. And the middle voice in this particular case does not mean what it's been argued to mean. A better understanding of it is really just to understand that you are going to be affected. You are part of the, not only are you going to live this way, but it's actually going to change you as you live in this way. So you're affected by the verbal idea, not that you're necessarily intentionally and intuitively doing it to yourself. That's not what's necessary to understand here about the middle voice. So the middle voice really indicates subject affectedness, not that the subject is acting on themselves and therefore needs to have this reflexive pronoun added in English. Sometimes it's necessary for English, but it's certainly not necessary for Greek, and it's certainly not what the word means when you look at what the middle voice is actually doing in the original Greek. So that's the third thing. The middle voice does not mean the subject is acting on himself. It may do in some cases, but it also really means that the subject is affected in some way by the action of the verb. So that's the third one. The fourth one is related to the middle voice as well, and that is much more common again, and I've talked about this in the past, and that is deponency. For a long time, grammars taught all the way up really until, let's say 2017 or so, we were still getting grammars being published with this, that the middle voice, there were verbs in the New Testament that were middle in form but active in meaning, and these were called deponent verbs. This idea has been really laid to rest for a good while. It's been about 15 years or so now since this was settled in the world of linguistics, particularly around New Testament linguistics. And much longer outside of New Testament linguistics. But anyway, the point is that people no longer should be saying, and you should not understand deponent verbs as deponent verbs. These are verbs that were active and had an active form, potentially, but the middle voice idea that we just talked about is actually still present in these middle-only forms. A good example of this, in my opinion, is perufo. Now, perufo, back in classical times, meant to carry or to transport, and it had a causative idea. So it has this idea of like to cause something to be transported. But what happened was it often got used to refer to the subject themselves. I'm going, I'm transporting myself. And so the idea there being, because this is now in the middle voice, is that I am the one affected by the action that I'm taking, and I'm now moving along. And so in the New Testament, we find perufomai, which is there all, lots of different places, which is just I go or I travel. And so that's how we understand the verb today. But that doesn't mean that there was never an active form, or that it's dropped out of use even. It may have, it may not have, but the point is that the middle verb, these are not active in meaning. They are middle verbs, and they are in the middle voice for a reason, and we're better off understanding them that way. And if you were taught deponency, it may be time to update your knowledge of Greek. Which brings me to the last one, the fifth one that we're going to look at today, which is the story about the barking dog. Now, this one goes back to an anecdote from 1904. There was a Greek student by the name of Thomas Davison who started learning Greek, and he was struggling with imperatives, the commands, and particularly the difference between an aorist command and a present command. When would you use one over the other? And he just happened to hear a Greek man who had a dog who barked, who was using the present verb when the dog was barking to say stop barking, and then use the aorist when the dog wasn't barking to say don't bark. And this particular individual, he went off and had a bit of a look at Plato and found a couple of instances in Plato where he could see that same trend being used. And so he wrote and basically put a paper out, and this got adopted into Greek grammars for over 80 years. So the assumption is that if you were using an aorist prohibition, a command to not do something in the aorist verb form, you were saying don't start doing this. If you were using the present prohibition, a present tense imperative in the negative, don't do, you were telling them to stop doing something currently in progress. And this was taught for 80 years. And it doesn't work quite that simply. There are times where you have parallel passages in the New Testament where you actually have the aorist in one, the aorist prohibition in one, and the present prohibition in another, and they're both really being used very similarly. So we don't have that kind of distinction that this particular individual thought that he was seeing when he observed the barking dog. It's amusing, I know, to think that one barking dog anecdote was used to really shape the form of grammars for 80 years. But there you go. Interesting things that have taken place that have been taught over the years that have been proven now to be incorrect understandings of these particular grammatical points. If you were taught these things, then it may be time for you to refresh your Greek, update it, so that you come up to date with the latest research and understand what's actually going on in the world of Greek grammar, so that you don't end up preaching things like durative presence in the Gospel of John to say this is an ongoing thing that always applies, like we hear week in and week out from pulpits all over the place. If this is you, we want to help you. You go to bma.to/getstarted. We'll help work out where you're at with your Greek and give you a plan to move forward from where you are right now so that you can actually update your Greek and come up to speed with where you're at. We actually start not only beginning Greek courses every quarter, but also more advanced Greek courses as well, including our course on 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, where we start to get you into some of the more advanced grammar as well. If you're interested in any of that, bma.to/getstarted. If you've come across the teachings here or any others that I've missed, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you there and look forward to reading your comments. Thanks so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. We'll see you there.